All right, should be recording now. All right, guys, welcome to today's meeting. Hope you all have signed in for us, and we got a great guest speaker that we're welcoming back. So let's get started. So we're going to start off with our announcements. E-board elections is coming up real soon. If you're interested, definitely you want to go ahead and run for it. Make sure that you guys are ready for this. You have a slide for us. And if you have any questions, feel free. Finn.
Oh, I see it. Oh, geez. Okay, well, it's fine.
Well, yeah.
Well, y'all get to see the kicks and giggles.
Exactly. It works. But yeah, if you guys want to have like a great e-board just like us, have all these kicks and giggles, you should definitely run. It's a great experience. And Range Force Austin.
Yeah, just to reiterate really quick, if you really enjoy the environment that we provide as our e-board, please do run for e-board. That way you can keep up that kind of environment and help uphold kind of like how our community is right now. But moving on from that, Range Force is a huge deal because, again, they're allowing us to have a student discount on their training platform that other professional organizations will utilize. I believe one of them was the stadium for the Warriors. I think it's the Chase Center, if I remember correctly. And so, if you're gonna do NCL,
it's the Chase Center. Sorry. Yeah, it's the Chase Center.
Yeah. So if you are going to do NCL, which I believe we'll talk about a little bit later, try Range Force as well. NCL is only for a season, whereas Range Force is a whole year, and it's pretty much a bang for your buck. Whether you're still new to cybersecurity, feel like your soft skills or technical skills aren't there. Sorry, technical skills. Give it a try, give it a shot. I think it's worthwhile because you can work on it for a whole year. But should put in the time to do it. A lot of our e-board member will be doing it, and we will be also doing like workshops so that we can all be working together. We will not be teaching you how to do something. It will be just collaborative. If you have any questions, then you can also ask us these things. Other than that, I'll let Amber discuss the upcoming events.
Upcoming events, National Cyber League. This is a great opportunity to hone your skills in cybersecurity. If you're new to cybersecurity and want to actually learn some better skills in regard to like OSINT, log analysis, network traffic analysis, cryptography, password cracking, web application security, enumeration, exploitation, this is a great way to actually learn. Let me know if you guys are interested. I will send out the link again over on Slack in general so that you guys are more than welcome to go ahead and join. Preseason is going on March 15th and the gym is going on right now. So it's a great way to actually get started. And then also we have a great opportunity from our Cal Poly Pomona student run SOC is offering us Splunk Fundamentals 1 and 2. This is a great value. It normally costs $2,000 to actually learn the Splunk fundamentals. So we do highly suggest signing up for this. The deadline is March 15th or March 14th. But if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and reach out to Jensen. He will go ahead and answer any kind of questions you may have. I've actually used Splunk in my past internship, so I would actually highly suggest signing up for this. And passing on to Jackie.
Hello. So just a quick reminder, the virtual spring career fair is on Thursday from 10:30 to 2:30. I'm going to go ahead and post the link in the chat for you guys. It's really great. The spring career fair is actually a big one if you're looking for internships and or jobs if you're graduating. I highly recommend you attend. The next video or slide I have for you guys is the ITC competition. So ITC registration did start. The ITC competition is the information technology competition with 5 case studies: IT strat, data analytics, forensics, web app, and security. You can form teams. You can reach out to Missa on Slack. Several FAST members here, Gayling, Austin, and myself, Edgar, a bunch of us have done ITC. They do give prize money for the winning teams. We placed last year, so if you're interested in doing it, it happens over a 2-week period over spring break. It's really fun. Highly recommend it. Even though it's virtual, it's still really fun. And I will go ahead and drop the link for that in the chat as well. And then before I forget, graduation stalls. So, and I'll also download that. I'll give you both of these links in the chat right now. If you are graduating, please come talk to me. Graduation stalls, the deadline is March 4th. If you have not paid your membership fees, the deadline did pass for the membership forms. So if you want a stall and have not paid and it's not covered in your membership fee, it's $30. If you're confused at all in any way, DM me and I'll take care of you. And then I'm gonna pass it back to, I believe, Austin for professional organization events.
So real quick, Asaka LA is doing an event next week, March 9th, on Tuesday at 5 p.m. And it's going to be discussing securing web, social, and team chat for information governance. And the guest speaker will be Gabby Kalal. And then now I will be introducing our very own guest speaker, Jordan Wheeler, who I happened to have the opportunity to have worked with him personally on his e-board. So without further ado, Jordan will be presenting on offensive security.
Thank you so much. Very grateful to be here with all of you. I see more than 20 people have attended. Many of you do not have your cameras on. Obviously, it's not a requirement, but I would encourage you to turn on your camera and really join in this discussion here. I think that will first of all help me see your reactions and help me gauge whether or not people find that interesting and whether it seems that they're confused. It is a bit difficult to present to a blank screen without faces, so I'd encourage you to put on your camera. With that said, let me go ahead and share my screen here. And let's see. I'm going to try to share a screen portion. Are you seeing that? Yep, cool. Thank you, Jackie. All right, so getting into it here, offensive security is another kind of euphemism. It's a term used to describe hackers, really. Offensive security being done from the perspective of securing an organization rather than breaching an organization for your own benefits, for your own malicious purposes. So when I say hacker, what is it that you all think of? And I'd love to see your responses in the chat. What do you think of when you hear the word hacker? Now, let me see how I can figure out how to there's the chat. Black hoodie. I got the stock photo, LMAO. I mean, this black hoodie? Represent, shady guy, hoodie, padlock, ones and zeros, nerd typing fast. This is the general image. I'm seeing nods. This is the general impression that we have of what a hacker is. I want to adjust your perspective here. Antisocial. Well, perhaps criminal hackers are antisocial. I'm a hacker, but I'm not a criminal. I am asocial. There's a big difference between antisocial and asocial. I got called antisocial when I was a kid. Antisocial is a guy who comes to your party and takes a dump in your punch bowl. Asocial is the guy that doesn't want to come to your party. That's me. But this is what a hacker looks like in the 21st century. This is what me and my colleagues look like at our job, right? This is a photo from Akamai, but the environment looks very similar. This is probably a security operations center. So this is more on the blue team side of what we're talking about, whereas I'm going to be showing you the red team side. So red team, blue team, what does that all mean, right? Is that like these guys? Anybody remember these video clips from way back in the day of the Halo players with the funny dialogue? Red team versus blue team. RVB, there you go, Jason, thank you. So red team versus blue team is a way of describing two kind of bicameral aspects of security, right? Bicameral meaning two parts of the same whole. So you have the blue team, which are typically defined as the defenders. Those can be your malware analysts. Those can be your SOC analysts operating in the security operations center. Those can be your incident responders. Those are the type of people who are looking for the attackers getting in. Those are the people who are responding to the attackers getting in. Those are the people who are investigating after the attackers have gotten in to build the system in such a way that it is more secure. The red team on the other side is what I'm going to be speaking more about. And the red team is more about the breaking inside. So we're actually trying to emulate the adversary. We're trying to do the same similar kinds of processes that a cyber criminal would perform. So red team is your offensive securities, emulating the bad guys or bad girls, finding the weak spots before they're exploited by the criminals. The blue team is the defensive professionals, implementing security controls to keep the bad guys out and responding to incidents when they do get in. Does that make sense to everybody? Seeing nods. All right. All right. Feel free to ask any questions as we go along, and I'll try to get to them as we go. So red team and blue team, there's also this concept called purple team, which is basically the idea that in an organization, if you have an internal team dedicated to red team and an internal team dedicated to blue team, there should be some collaboration and overlap between them so that the blue team and the red team are working in tandem. So there's a few different roles within the red team, right? And one that I'm more familiar with is penetration testing. That's this one in the center here. Pen testing, as it's called, does not mean checking to see if your pen works. Pen testing, or penetration testing, also known as ethical hacking, is actually performing the simulated attacks against systems to validate vulnerabilities. Now that's different than vulnerability analysis, right? Vulnerability analysis is actually simply identifying, quantifying, meaning counting, and prioritizing security vulnerabilities. And this is often done primarily in an automated fashion. You could be using software like Nessus. You could be using something from Rapid7. You could be using Qualys. You could be using OpenVAS. There's several different pieces of software. And what they're going to do is they're going to connect to the scope that you have defined, and that will be typically IP addresses. And it will actually contact each of those IP addresses and query them and actually ask for a response and try to investigate in a sort of minimally active, right? So it's not entirely passive, meaning that you're not touching the system at all, but it's going to be very minimally invasive, only querying to get information out of the system. What do you provide? What services are you running on this system? What ports are open for communication? What operating system are you running on? What versions of the software are you running in? What configuration is this system set up in? And vulnerability analysis is the practice of taking those that information about essentially kind of diagnostic information or informational data about what the systems are and how they're configured, and then identifying how those configurations could lead to vulnerabilities in that system. Now, some vulnerabilities that you could find in a system could be, for example, a login that doesn't require a password. So a service could be running on a system, for example, SSH. SSH is a command line terminal access for a system. So I can open up my terminal, type in SSH root at IP, and then connect to that system. And over a terminal command line, I can communicate and administer that system based on my privileges. Now, if that root at IP address doesn't return a prompt to ask for what my password is to ask to administer as root, then that would be a vulnerability, because that means that anyone who knows that there is SSH running on this system, they could log in for free without any kind of authorization or authentication. Another vulnerability could be that a system, a service, or an application on the system is running, but it's out of date. So an out-of-date system could have security vulnerabilities inherent in them. Security vulnerabilities are identified in software all the time. And that's one of the reasons that we always encourage our customers, our clients, our friends, and our colleagues to always make sure that their systems and their software is up to date. Because if vulnerabilities are identified in a software and we're running the older version of that software, that means that our version of the software contains those vulnerabilities. We need to update that system in order to close those vulnerabilities. So that could be another type of vulnerability. Now, there is a bit of interpretation that goes into vulnerability analysis. And another thing that's really important here is the communication of why these vulnerabilities are important to the organization. Because when it comes down to it, cybersecurity is not really about locking everything up securely. It's more about managing risk. And especially when you get to working for a large organization, I work at IBM Security. Not only is IBM Security and IBM itself a very large organization, but most of our customers are very large organizations. I'm talking about banks, I'm talking about major retailers, I'm talking about other technology companies, and even governments and government agencies. And when you get to that level, the ability of the organization to effectively close every security hole, large or small, becomes diminished. They may have more capability of doing work, but it will cost them too much to patch every single hole, both in terms of time as well as finances. So a better strategy for most organizations is to manage that risk. We want to identify what vulnerabilities, what risks that we have are of the greatest importance. Which of those vulnerabilities are going to be affecting potentially our crown jewels, the most important parts of our organization. Maybe that's our data, maybe that's our finances, maybe that's our customer base. Whichever vulnerabilities are the most likely of being exploited with the most ease or the least difficulty, and are going to have the greatest impact, should be prioritized over vulnerabilities otherwise. And depending on what the organization's preference is in terms of what they want to protect, and also what their risk tolerance is. Another way of mitigating risk is buying insurance. You know that your car could be stolen on the street, so you buy insurance because you can't prevent your car from being stolen from a very dedicated adversary. And insurance is a way of reducing risk, but it does not reduce vulnerability. So I hope you get that distinction. So penetration testing is really an evolution of vulnerability analysis. We've taken these vulnerabilities that we've identified, and now we're going to test to validate that they are actually genuinely exploitable. So that was my job as a penetration tester. And I also competed at the collegiate penetration testing competition. My team, Cal Poly, about half Swift members and about half FAST members. We competed at regionals, placed second, and went to nationals and placed third place nationally. And we learned so much about penetration testing there. And one thing that I learned in that experience is that it's not just about validating that the holes are exploitable. It's really about communicating that risk to the client, right? And so we're going to get into that in a little bit here about how we communicate that to our clients. But pen testing is much more akin to what we might call hacking than vulnerability analysis is, because vulnerability analysis is identifying those vulnerabilities, prioritizing them, and communicating with the client. Penetration testing actually actively goes and attempts to do what the attacker would do in that situation to exploit the vulnerability. So that would be logging in by SSH, not simply identifying that there is an SSH server that doesn't require a password, but logging in as root, taking a screenshot, and demonstrating what access that we have. Now, it's not just demonstrating what access that we have initially from that exploit, but chaining them together to identify what could be done with this vulnerability. And so it becomes much less of theory and much more active exploration throughout the network once you've gained a foothold. However, penetration testing is very distinguished from red teaming in the fact that penetration testing is always done with the approval and knowledge of the IT crew, right? So the information technology crew, the security operations center, the blue team knows that the penetration testing is going on. And there's a defined scope of what the penetration tester is allowed to actively attack. So therefore, the blue team can be watching the logs, watching the impact, and seeing what the pen tester is doing. And if there's anything that is causing instability or issues for usability of the system by the client, by their employees, by their customers, the blue team could very likely reach out to the pen tester and say, hey, we're getting issues here. We need you to cut back on the speed of your scanning or the type of attack that you're doing, or maybe we need to do it off hours so that your attacks are not impacting the usability of these systems. So whereas penetration testing is known and essentially monitored by the blue team, red teaming, true red teaming, is very different. True red teaming is not something that's performed during a day or a week. Red teaming is something that occurs over a long period of time. And this is really emulating what a cyber criminal would do, going slow, being quiet, laying low, sneaking in undetected, exploiting vulnerabilities without leaving many signals that they've done so, and then escalating their access and accessing as much of the system as possible, trying to get as close to those crown jewels as possible without alerting the blue team. So whereas penetration testing is testing the systems themselves, red teaming is really testing the process. How do we identify, how do we respond to a cyber criminal intrusion? How does that threat hunting work? How well does that threat hunting work? So you can kind of think as vulnerability analysis as a bit of an audit, performed by an auditor. Penetration testing is kind of like hiring a pirate to come test your security. He's going to be loud. He's going to be, you're going to notice them. He's probably going to knock some things over, and he may not have a lot of self-control. A good pen tester always has self-control, but I mean, that's how it may appear to the blue team. And then a true red teamer is much more like a ninja, hiring a ninja to test your systems, because they're going to be attempting to stay under the radar as long as possible, to persist in the environment. And really their goal is to eventually get caught, but they will persist and they will continue as long as they can without getting caught. Any questions so far? All right. So just a little bit more detail. Jason asks, is pen testing like a one-time event? Yes, in some cases it is. It's something you need to do regularly. If your organization deals with debit or credit card transactions, it's actually regulated by a regulation called PCI DSS. That's the Payment Card Industry Digital Security Standard. And that is, that requires an annual pen test. So most of the pen tests that I performed in my work were for PCI customers. And for them, their priority was that checkbox. Obviously, they wanted to fix some of the findings that I got, but they were less concerned with really emulating a cyber criminal. And that's why they didn't go for a red team. They just wanted that pen test. How much time is spent on documenting each step versus actually initiating or researching the attack? Quite a bit of time. It would be difficult to ballpark. So I would say that researching an attack typically is quite a bit of my time. I identify the vulnerability through vulnerability analysis, and then I'm researching how that vulnerability is exploited and testing my tools on other systems to make sure that I know how to use them before I actually start pointing them at my target. Documentation is a significant portion of the work. You need to document everything that you've attempted, whether it worked or whether it didn't, and you need to document the outcome. And then reporting comes afterwards, and that is a significant portion of the actual pen test process. As far as initiating the attack, initiating an attack may not take very long, but the actual attack process, the full attack chain, may take more time. The red teamers give the IR a heads up if they're planning on doing any pen test. So there's kind of getting back to the distinction here that red team would be done with permission of the organization, but probably at the VP level or higher. So the executive has authorized the red team event, but the blue team, even the blue team managers in many cases, aren't aware that it's going on. And so then they really want to get a natural response from the blue team. Red team is emulating how a real attack is like, exactly. Absolutely, it's key that we know how to write good reports. In fact, that's one of the reasons that they really liked me during my internship, was that I'm really good at writing reports, and I can understand what the pen testers, who are much more capable than I am, what they had found, and by probing them and having a dialogue with them, I could understand what that finding meant, do my own research, and put together a mitigation strategy and a really impact strategy. So just a little bit here about the differences between these three. Vulnerability assessor is probably using automated tools primarily. We're going to be reviewing the infrastructure, really, not just source code, but really the kind of fundamentals of the system here. Compliance standards are going to be very important to a vulnerability assessor as well as any of the others. And you're really working to help manage that risk. In fact, you may know Melody Liu. She's a colleague of mine. She was the vice president when I was president at FAST. She works as a vulnerability management consultant. So they are performing automated assessments and then helping the organization manage those risks and prioritize in a systematic way. And that could take seasons, quarters, it could take years before the majority of those findings are actually mitigated. So vulnerability assessment is something that's ongoing. Penetration testing is something that probably happens once or maybe a few times per year. Red teaming probably happens less often, but is going to occur over a longer period of time. Anthony, for unmuting, let's keep that towards the end. I want to make sure that we have enough time, but you're welcome to ask a text question for now. So again, difference between penetration testing and red teaming is that pen testing is performing tests to identify vulnerabilities and validate those vulnerabilities, but they're not doing it in a way that needs to be sustained and highly stealthy. So with a red team, you're really kind of emulating that advanced persistent threat, not just your automated attacks. There's many automated attacks. Those are more identified in your vulnerability assessment. A red teamer is going to be more advanced professional, and they probably are able to develop their own custom malware payloads, their own exploits. They might even identify their own zero-day vulnerabilities that were never identified previously. And you may perform things like physical security engagements, social engineering engagements. Those are typically under the more red teaming category, as opposed to a pen test. You could have an authorized pen test, but a physical pen test or a social engineering pen test wouldn't be very effective if people knew that it was coming. So some of the skills that you want to have for the red team is definitely on the soft side here. We want to be able to think creatively and analytically, right? So logic is very important, but being able to be creative in our problem solving is also really important. Another really important standard that needs to be in every red teamer, and obviously every security professional overall, is having a high standard of ethics. In red teaming, you're going to be gaining access to private information by definition. And you have to be held to an ethical standard that's going to allow your client to know that you're not going to steal that information or otherwise abuse that information. And then again, on the soft skills, we need to be able to explain what we found. We need to be able to explain the methodologies and motivations of cyber criminals. And we need to be able to explain that in both verbal and written format, right? Formal reports, and to multiple audiences. You may be addressing the engineers directly who are going to be implementing the mitigations or the system changes that you recommend. But you also need to be able to address non-technical audiences, because, for example, if human resources needs to use their systems differently, they're not necessarily technical-minded people. They're certainly not technical professionals from this perspective. And of course, then there's the varying levels of an organization too. You've got all the way down to the analyst and the technician, all the way up to the executives and the president. And depending on where somebody is in that stack, that person may not be very familiar with technical jargon. You really need to be able to communicate things on their level. Some of the hard skills, the technical skills that we want to see in a red teamer is you need to be familiar with both Windows and Linux operating systems, their internals, their configuration, how you set them up, how they are administered, what their potential vulnerabilities are there. Programming languages are important. I wouldn't say essential, but you have to be able to, at least for a vulnerability assessor or a pen tester, you need to be comfortable enough to use them, to read code. You don't necessarily have to be a software developer, but if you want to escalate to the level of a true red teamer, you're probably going to want to be pretty proficient at Python, Perl, Ruby, and these other languages that enable you to either write your own exploit code or to chain together existing exploit code and run tools in sequence or in parallel. There's many different offensive security toolkits that we use in the offensive security realm. Kali Linux is a Linux operating system prepackaged with many of these tools. Metasploit Framework is a modular system that allows many different types of payloads to be delivered in a systematic way. And Cobalt Strike is another very similar to Metasploit framework, but that actually enables much more interaction. And Armitage, for example, that allows collaboration amongst team members. And of course, you need to know either, depending on what you're pen testing, you might not need to know a lot of TCP/IP networking ports and services. Maybe you need to know more about web apps and how the web transmits over a browser. Maybe you're more focused on mobile apps, or maybe you're more focused on cloud, but at least one of those areas you should have a very high comfort level, if not specialization. Kevin asks, what helped you improve your writing and documenting skills before you started working in the industry? That was an area that I excelled at throughout most of my school, but that was because I took reports in school seriously. I took them as opportunities to improve my communication. If you are completing reports in any of your classes, essays, papers, research papers, etc., and you're not taking it seriously, you're basically throwing away money on your education that you are, that you've already paid for. This is an opportunity not just to pass the class, but to improve your skills. And when you get to your internship, when you get to your job, you'll be really grateful that you took those seriously. Okay. Another thing that I want to point out here is that each of these three levels are not only increasing in complexity and in the technical expertise required, but they all need to be performed in some kind of systematic way. Obviously, red teaming is going to have a lot more creativity in the way that they are able to go about their role. Penetration testing, there's a little bit less creativity, and there's a real standard, a methodology that should be followed. And then vulnerability analysis is very similarly, that is going to be a little bit more simplified in terms of process. So I have another presentation here. Let me just switch my slides real quick. Okay, now I want to introduce you to the penetration testing execution standard. Let me move this over. So this is a standard, a methodology that is available open source online, and it is a way to standardize the execution of a penetration test, right? So it covers everything related to a pen test, starting with the initial communication with the client, doing scoping, helping them understand what a pen test is and what it isn't, all the way through scoping and identifying what should be tested and what should not be tested, the initial engagement of scanning and identifying what assets are accessible, testing for vulnerabilities, exploiting them, escalating your privileges, finding out what you can gain, really identifying what the risks are, and then reporting at the end. So I encourage you to take a note of www.pentest-standard.org, bookmark that, and read up on it if you're interested in offensive security. So here's the overall view of the standard. I've got pre-engagement. That's where you're initially communicating. Intel gathering is typically passive. Threat modeling, that's where you're trying to identify what type of attacker and their methodology. Vulnerability analysis, we mentioned. Then we go beyond that into exploitation. Post-exploitation is actually using the system and moving laterally or escalating your privileges to gain more access. And then finally, reporting. So let's go through some of these. Pre-engagement, as I said, was going to be your scoping. So that's identifying what systems you're allowed to test and perhaps under what means. Perhaps they know that there are systems that are out of date and they don't really need another 10-page report telling them which systems are out of date. Maybe they've already done their vulnerability assessment. What they really want you to do is to test these vulnerabilities, but not vulnerabilities that affect availability only vulnerabilities that affect confidentiality. There's all kinds of different things that an organization may be concerned with. Maybe they want a wireless pen test. They want to test how somebody could access their network through the Wi-Fi or through other wireless means, and they don't really care about the physical access. Maybe the physical is more of importance, etc. So we're going to identify the actual assets and areas that are allowed to be tested. We're going to define how we're allowed to go about them and what tools are appropriate for that too. Also in pre-engagement, you're going to be discussing, if you're doing this independently or your organization will be discussing with the client, how the payment would go, what the timelines are like, how often communication needs to be occurring, and by what methods those communications with the client should be coming. Johannes, I'll get back to your question on that one. That's a good one. Okay, so the next stage of the penetration testing execution standard is intelligence gathering. So this is performing reconnaissance against your target. And we're using that military intelligence term here, reconnaissance. Reconnaissance is done at a distance. It's not done in the face of the target. It's not done in their living room. It's going to be done passively. And so in a network pen test, which is what I'm familiar with, I would be perhaps sending, I may or may not be sending a ping to the system because that is semi-active. But what I might be doing is identifying open source intelligence sources that can tell me about this thing that already knows something about it. So for example, I could use Google to identify websites that are under the target's name. Let's say my target is a company called Bain & Ox. So I do a Google search for Bain & Ox and I try to identify websites that are associated with them. There are many other tools that will do similar things. You can search by domain, you can search by IP, you can search and extrapolate other areas that the organization is connected to. By using third-party services rather than testing them myself, what that's doing is that's keeping distance in between my target. And it's also valuable for the customer, the client, to know how much information is available about them and whether or not they need to make changes to hide some of that information. The more information that's available about a target, the more possible attack vectors there are. Okay, so we've gathered some information about what the systems are and what we think might have vulnerabilities. Now with this information, we want to identify what type of attacker would come after this. If it's a political organization, perhaps the target or the attacker would be more motivated by politics. If it's a financial organization or a business, maybe they're more motivated by financial gain. If they're a competitor, perhaps they're more motivated by simply denying operation. So again, we want to identify what type of attacker is going to be coming after them and what types of methods or types of attacks they would be performing. If the organization is very well secured to the point where it's not likely to be targeted by somebody who's just scanning the entire internet and throwing any kind of payload that they can find at the targets, what they're really concerned about are the very advanced persistent attackers, then those are the types of threats that we should model and not waste our time with the automated stuff. Following that is going to be vulnerability analysis. We've spoken about this at length. Trying to find misconfigurations and other insecurities within the system that could be exploited. And then validating them is actually testing those vulnerabilities and trying to break into the system using that vulnerability. So that's what exploitation is. And by exploiting the system, it could be affecting any level of the CIA triad, right? The CIA triad is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So confidentiality could mean I have access to something that I shouldn't have, information that I shouldn't have. Integrity would be that data is now corrupted or corruptible because of my access or because I can interfere with it. And then availability would be I can delete this information, I can remove this information, or I can put some wall in between the user and that information that prevents them from being able to use it. So we may be throwing code at an application which doesn't know how to properly handle that. That would be a payload. We may be tricking the system by sending it a request that has been forged There's all kinds of different things that can be done to exploit a system, but the main point here is to either gain access or to interrupt some level of that CIA triad. So now this exploitation is what most people think of when they think of pen testing. Now it's what they think of when they think of hacking. But really, as this pen test standard shows, it's just a part of the actual process. Post-exploitation, once I've gained access to a system, I want to be able to use that access, leverage that access to gain more access, to gain more privileges. So for example, if I am able to log on to your corporate computer system as a user, I want to access that corporate computer system as an administrator. So finding vulnerabilities in the system is that next level. Once we've found vulnerabilities and exploited them to get to the system, we need to do it again to gain more access. And again, this whole time we're gathering information on what our findings are, what we were able to do, what we were not able to do, so that we can put them together in our report. And that report, unfortunately or fortunately, my friends, is really what it's the product. It's what the client cares about. They don't really care how elite you are. They don't really care how badly they got pwned. What they want to know is, what are my risks? What can be done to remediate those vulnerabilities or mitigate the risks of these vulnerabilities? And this is structured in a very standard reporting way. You should become very familiar with this. I would encourage you to run a vulnerability analysis on your own network at home with permission of anybody who uses it, and identify vulnerabilities there. Or maybe you don't find anything, but try to build a report in this structure, starting with an executive summary that is basically in plain English, very short, maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs, explaining overall what the findings were. Was it really bad? Did they do really well, etc. Then we're going to have all the vulnerabilities that we found, and that's typically in a ranked list in terms of priority that the penetration tester identifies or the red teamer identifies as the highest priority. We're going to have more details about what those findings are, what the actual vulnerability means, and recommendations of how they can remediate it. And then there may be more technical information in an appendix, which actually gives more context. So for example, we're able to access this database. We just had a screenshot of it, but here's the configuration of that database included in the appendix. And the conclusion, like any good report, is going to restate the intro. It's going to re-emphasize what was stated in the executive summary, but with a little bit more oomph, because now we've told you all the details of it. Interesting question, David. I'll get to that in just a second too. So this is an example of a penetration test report that we did for our penetration testing competition. This was from a couple of years ago. Our client was Wheels. It was an automated taxi service. So you can see we've got our table of contents, got the overview. That's basically our executive summary. We also included a methodology to explain what it is that we were doing and what our process was. We followed penetration testing execution standard. Another standard that you should look up is the OWASP top 10. That's not really a methodology, but it does provide the top 10 web vulnerabilities, and it's a standard for testing against. The next thing that we have here is our assessment methodology. So we're explaining that depending on 2 variables, the likelihood of exploitation and the impact on the organization of the exploitation, we will identify if the risk for that vulnerability is low, medium, high, or critical. And we'll do that for all of our vulnerabilities. Here's the network topology as we found it. So this is what we were able to access and what we identified. This may be smaller than what the organization actually has. Maybe we couldn't find everything. Here's our real executive summary. So ours is a bit long. Attack narrative was something that we liked to include. So this is basically like that threat modeling, explaining how an attacker could use what we found in order to get in and to do their damage. Strategic recommendations is kind of putting the cart before the horse. Here's what we really recommend. If you're not going to read any further, please read this and make sure that you can improve your overall security posture even without getting into the details. Then we're going to get into all of the assessment findings. So in this case, it was the technical vulnerability was IDOR, but what it really means was that we could request rides as another user, which means that we could do it on their dime. We're going to show some screenshots of what we found and how we were able to execute that vulnerability, the impact of that vulnerability, our assessment of it as to whether its impact is high, likelihood is high, and therefore the risk assessment is critical, and our recommendation here. And then we're going to continue to do that for all of our findings. And at the very end, we'll have some of our appendices and additional information, because we found this was not something that we were asked to test, but we found some concerning information, sensitive documents that were shared publicly on an open forum. Okay, so I know that we're coming close to the top of the hour here, and I want to make sure that we have opportunities for everybody to ask questions. I do want to highlight one other framework, the OSS, I always get this wrong, OSSTMM, the Open Source Security Testing Methodology Manual. I'm not very familiar with this one, but I asked my friend who's an experienced pen tester, who's also a Cal Poly grad. He recommended that we all take a look at the Open Source Security Testing Methodology Manual as an alternative or as a supplement to the pen test execution standard. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop blabbing and I'm going to open it up to questions. Thank you, everyone. All right, so Johans asks, what language or tools would you recommend students learn first for pen testing? Whichever operating system you use, if you use Mac, learn Bash, because that's what the terminal works with. If you are on Windows, learn PowerShell and Command. So those are the languages that the interaction on the terminal are going to use. Learn how to use your computer as an administrator, right? As a technology professional, as an engineer. As for what programming language you should learn first, go with what interests you. If you're more interested in writing software for computers, maybe it should be C++ or Java. If you're more interested in writing or testing software for web applications, you probably want to learn more JavaScript, ASP, things like that. So it really depends on what environment you want to learn more about. There's no first one that's perfect for everybody. How prevalent is it for competing companies to perform cyber attacks against each other? You know, that's a good question, David. I really don't know what the prevalence is, but I do know that there are cyber criminals that are hired on behalf of other companies. And it's not always a company versus a company. Very often it's country against country. So a country will be attacking for competitive reasons, their economic competitor in the region or globally. Would you recommend students use TryHackMe? Absolutely. Let me see, do I have? I don't have my resources here. I'll get some resources for you all. Here's a couple of more tips of where you can gain some value during your academic career. TryHackMe is fantastic for learning the basics of pen testing, but you might need to learn some more basics before you even get there. Over the Wire is a really cool CTF online that teaches you how to use SSH and how the basics of Linux works. Hack the Box is another alternative to TryHackMe. There's also VulnHub, V-U-L-N-H-U-B, Vulnerability Hub, that has ISOs, downloadable virtual machines that you can run on your computer and learn how to attack those. So Kevin asks, have you accidentally stepped outside of your allowed scope? And so what did you do? How did you communicate that to your employer? Yes, I have incorrectly set my scope in my scan and accidentally scanned areas that I wasn't supposed to. And unfortunately, in that instance, it did cause a business impact. So our client was not very happy about that. And I had to go to my manager to kind of have them play some interference so that they could get back on the good side of the company. And remember, we may have the permission of management, but we don't necessarily have the buy-in from the IT administrators. We may be making their job more difficult for that day or that week. Any other questions? We have a couple more minutes, but do we need to leave time for a conclusion?
It is totally up to you, sir.
All right.
Oh, you're good.
Anybody else have any other questions? I'd really be happy to answer them.
I don't have a
I'm gonna call out
question.
Anthony. There you go ahead, Finn.
Somebody started to speak up.
I was about to say it. I didn't have a question, but I do have a little something for Old Fast members.
Nice. Back in the day when we could get pizza.
Fresh batch from Costco Burbank.
All right, I'm gonna show you a couple job listings. These are at IBM, obviously my employer. You can work wherever you would like, but I think that IBM is a great place to work. There's a mobile pen testing consultant job opportunity right now. So if you're interested in working on mobile applications, that's something that you could look into. This one's also mobile. This is red team operator. So once you get to that level where you can really be a full-time red teamer, that would be an option for you. How about mainframes? Mainframes is a really interesting one because almost every major bank in the world still relies on mainframes, and almost nobody knows how to administer or secure them. So a couple of really interesting talks at DEF CON about pen testing and exploiting mainframes and the amount of information that's available there. What else do we have? Here's an entry-level one. This is probably it's in Austin, Texas. If any of you remember Jonathan Chua, he was a president before me at FAST. He joined as an entry-level pen tester and joined the Austin team, and he now works fully remotely living out of California. And if you really want to grow in your career, you can become an associate partner. A partner is somebody who buys into the business and actually gets some of the profit also. So that level is typically very highly regarded. Kevin asks, are there any cons you recommend tuning into? He's heard of Cactus Con and DEF CON. I'm not too familiar with Cactus Con, to be honest with you. There's so many these days, and thankfully they're online now. Shell Con is another one that's local in the US. There's also ShmooCon is another. B-Sides. B-Sides is a really great one. There's a few different locations for B-Sides. That one's really good at helping people get into the industry. And then there's some that are more certification oriented. So you guys have mentioned some of the meetings, ISSA and ISACA. They all have conferences too. DerpCon. There's Wild West Hacking Fest. I've seen that one on YouTube, but I've never been there. That's, I think, like Tennessee or something like that. All right, I know that we're at the top of the hour here. I really appreciate all of you joining me for this long-winded explanation of pen testing. I'm being pinged in the background by my colleague who is listening in here, and they say that pen testers at IBM are required to move to Texas for their first 2 years. And that's pretty good because you want to be a part of that team, part of that community. Oh, ITSec in Arizona, that's Cactus Con, or Wild West. Anyway, any more questions? I'd love to hang out with you guys all day, but.
I don't know if Anthony wants to come off his mic. I know he had a question, but it was a little long-winded, so I don't know if he wants to come off and say his question.
I'm ready for it, Anthony.
Okay, it was a two-parter. So after you write your report, how involved are you with the IT department of the company you just did the testing? And if you are involved with them, have you had any negative experiences?
So in my role personally, I have not. It was basically deliver the report to management, and then they would relay that and the priorities as they saw fit to the actual engineers. I know that in some cases, the pen tester may be consulted on an ongoing basis to help them understand more about how that vulnerability is exploited and how it could be mitigated. But that would typically be a short-term process and not something you'd be actively involved in for a long term. I see Jason's also got his hand up. Is there another question?
Oh, yeah, it's a bit more of a juvenile question, but what operating system do you prefer using?
What operating system do you use on your computer? My other computer is your computer. I've got a Windows box here. I've got a VMware box here. I'm working on a Mac for work. I've got a Linux box next to me. I'm multilingual in terms of operating system. But my knowledge is millions of miles wide and only a few inches deep. I'm not a Linux administrator or a software developer, you know, that's just me. Kevin?
Yeah, what are some personal projects that you worked on or that you put on like your resume to land that job at IBM?
Yeah, well, my internship definitely helped. That would probably be the thing that I give the most credit to on my resume in terms of getting me the job. Also, being involved in the collegiate pen testing competition and CCDC, the cyber defense competition. I cannot understate how valuable those have been in terms of building my resume and giving me the confidence to act as a professional. In terms of my own self-education, before I joined FAST, before I rejoined the academia, before I went to Cal Poly, I joined a small organization called Lethal, which is in Southern California. You may have heard of Peter Kim. He's a very established pen tester and red teamer. He's written several books called the Hacker Playbook. It's also a really great resource if you want to look into it. And it's basically like a mini DEF CON that was held monthly. And that was my first exposure to other cybersecurity professionals. And that was really a great opportunity to learn the jargon, to get comfortable with cybersecurity and the professions. And then he started doing trainings. And that's where I learned my first bits of the penetration testing and ethical hacking.
And the organization you said was called Lethal LA or?
Yep, Lethal LA, yep.
Awesome.
Lethal Security.
Thanks, Jordan.
Absolutely. Well, you guys haven't all bailed on me yet, so you must find it somewhat interesting.
So last year, just to give you guys a little tidbit, we had like something going on with Peter Kim. And unfortunately, because of COVID, it got cut short and canceled. But basically, Peter Kim gave us an opportunity to go ahead and attend a weekend-long training for, with Lethal. But hopefully in the future, we'll be able to get that up and running again.
I'm not sure if he's doing it online yet, but hopefully so. But even failing that, there's so many organizations now that are doing online training. And we've talked about Hack Me and Hack the Box and all these different. Another one that I didn't mention is the National, National Cyber League.
National Cyber League, yep.
I didn't participate too much in that. I got my toes wet. I think you did, right, Amber?
Mm-hmm. All thanks to Austin. I went ahead and joined with him last semester, and it was a lot of fun.
I mean, it started with the e-board Wheeler.
Yeah,
you guys are the ones that started NCL. I continued it.
Oh yeah, I just shill these things and do as I say, not as I do, right? Any other questions? I see Professor Chin is with us. Thank you for joining us, Professor Chin. If you have anything that you'd like to add, you know a lot more about the industry than I do. Guess not.
I got a question. This is, I guess, to you, Jordan, and I guess the rest of the e-board. How would you compare going to these competitions like online versus in person?
I mean, the biggest difference is that you can do it in your pajamas. A lot of pen testing is done online anyway. So in that regard, it's not totally different. But there's definitely a lack of community and camaraderie that you would get if you were doing it in person. And that's a shame that we're lacking that in 2020 and 2021.
So to add more into it.
Yeah.
I was going to say, to add more to that, based off of the social engineering CTF that we actually did last semester, yes, majority of us did it from our PJs. However, it was easier to do it online than it would be like in person. I don't know how it would actually be in person, possibly most likely the same way. but I was actually really surprised to see how well we worked and also how hard we worked trying to get all the flags. And funny thing, OSINT was one of our best ones, only because I helped out a lot of people with some of my resources doing OSINT, and that was one of the reasons why we actually did so well. And also the reports, it helped a lot. So if you know how to do reports, by all means, it helped out a lot with us for the CTF for sure. I know Austin played a big part on that one since he was used to Professor Chin's reports. So, yeah.
Yeah, and on that note, if you have the opportunity to, well, or the requirement to write a report for your class, like try to be as professional about it as possible. Think about delivering it to a customer, right? To a paying client, not just somebody who's going to rubber stamp your, affect your GPA and you're just going to walk off with your diploma. It's an opportunity to grow. One thing that I mentioned during my talk to Dr. Manson's class last week was that the last 2 years that I was at Cal Poly, every report that I wrote for class, I wrote on the topic of IBM. So I needed to do a corporate history. I did that on IBM. I needed to do a financial analysis. I did that on IBM. I needed to write a report about a new advancing technology. I did that about a technology at IBM. And that was because I was targeting IBM. I wanted to work at the cyber range at IBM. And so that gave me, from the perspective of I'm going to give this to IBM or I'm going to show a customer what IBM's about, that also gave me more information about my employer. So when I went to the job interview, I had so much more knowledge, so much more confidence, and so much more ammunition to go into it with.
Yeah, and then I'll also preface that you don't feel as nervous doing it online because you're comfortable at home.
Right.
So it definitely helps a lot. But I will say that competitions online do kind of suck, in my opinion, because I like the personal experience and like being able to socially interact with everybody. One of the things that had happened in the past year that none of us got to experience in person is country to country CTF, where if you got selected, you would be flown out to London and you'd be working with a bunch of students internationally to do a competition. Unfortunately, we had to do that online. But again, if you get that opportunity, getting to hear from other countries and how their perspective is in terms of how they approach different problems is actually really unique because it gives you more insight and allows you to broaden your scope. So that's like one of those competitions that we unfortunately missed out because of the online era. But I will say, I think competing in person for the social aspect and being able to interact immediately, get the communication immediately, and just kind of get all your answers, or all your questions answered. Sorry, I worded that so poorly, but yeah. Competitions are fun. I think it's worthwhile if you want to do them. It looks good on the resume or on your LinkedIn if you want to add those.
There's a question for you, Austin and Amber. There's benefits to doing it online. Austin, you mentioned it being more comfortable.
Right.
But is being more comfortable always a benefit, especially in a competition?
Yeah.
That's your personal, I think it's how you view it personally, right? Because if you want that feeling of uncomfortableness and like feeling yourself grow immediately, like at the competition right there and then maybe doing the competition at home and feeling comfortable isn't the thing for you, right? But for some people, being able to kind of feel comfortable because they're already outside of their element and having some sort of something to hold on to, like being at home per se, that helps them, right? So it's again how you help yourself get through a competition, right? Because everyone gets through a competition differently. So when I was competing with my e-board members for SecCTF, which was like the third or fourth group competition I did, other ones I've also done individually or with a different group of friends, it's a different environment when you work with people. But yeah, that would be the short and simple answer.
If I could, to Jordan's point, actually, number one, I think on the reporting writing, the benefit of being in cybersecurity or a CIS major, as most of you are, if you can combine your business and your tech, it is like key. It's something I'm a huge advocate for. So I think that will make you stand out in the crowd if you can talk to not only the management, but to also your developers or pen testers, because so far that gap is very small. That's like my big thing. So when Jordan talked about that, I'm like, yes. On the competition levels, regardless if it's online, I still take it seriously. For ITC, even though it was online, I was dressed in a suit head to toe.
There you go.
And I just wanted to say, because I know it's a little more comfortable because you're not staring at him, but we don't know how long we're going to be in this virtual environment. A lot of things are shifting towards virtual environment. So I urge you now to stop being, just in general to anyone, stop being complacent, take it seriously, because if you can handle this online, if you're a consultant, you have to talk to people online all day, every day. So I encourage you to make use of the camera, make use of eye contact. If you're comfortable, you're doing something wrong. That's my personal opinion, but I can say that from experience I've done. I can say that from offers I've gotten. Every time I've done something, I've always made sure that I've pushed myself outside of my comfort zone. So don't use online or COVID as an excuse. That goes as well as your academics. You're paying all this money for Cal Poly education. Make sure you're doing something with it. So that was my tidbit.
So the point that I was hoping to drive to was that growth occurs in painful areas. You can't have growth without pain, because growth by definition is change, and change is always going to be painful. And so we have a desire to be comfortable because we don't want to have pain. We don't want to experience pain. But that's really where we find growth. And I do agree with you, Austin, that we don't want to be overwhelmed by the pain, by the discomfort. We don't want it to impact us so much that we're not able to move forward. So I totally understand that being at home helps lessen that discomfort, but it's still going to be discomfortable, uncomfortable. If we wanted to stay where we were truly comfortable, we wouldn't get out of bed at all. We wouldn't compete in the online competitions at all. But we all know that that's how we get cancer. That's how we die, right? And if you don't put yourself into positions where you are uncomfortable, then you won't grow. I've learned that I don't learn much when I'm not effing things up at least a little bit. Making mistakes is how I learn. So being willing to put yourself into that situation is important. And even just putting on the shoes and pants is important, even if they're off camera, because it makes you feel differently. You deliver differently. It's like wearing a uniform at work versus just wearing your casual clothes. You ever go into a restaurant where they can wear whatever they want? The service is always garbage. You go to a place where people stand up straight and they wear a uniform and they care about their presentation. It's differently. So that's my two thoughts as the old man here. But I value so much our time together. I look forward to joining you soon. I got to drop off for another meeting that I've been delaying right now, so I got to give them some respect. But thank you everybody for your time, and I look forward to seeing you at the next in-person event, I hope. DEF CON, right?
Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you so much,
All
Jordan.
right, take care, Jordan. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, Jordan.
guys.